have Ann come back up here, and we're going to talk about kind of moving forward after you get your baseline report. How can SEC then help a producer take the next step and create more opportunities for their operation? And then we'll finish up, speaking of opportunities, talking about carbon programs and carbon markets. So with that, Ann.
Oh, thank you. All right. Sound-wise, good again? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining again. I'm excited for the next portion of the conversation. Appreciated all the questions. I think that, as I mentioned, I think that really makes sessions like these. So thanks for the attention. So as Ashley mentioned, collecting data and going through the reporting is incredibly important to be able to set a baseline and know where we're at, because we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we're at right now. The second part of this conversation is how we talk about sustainable continuous improvement. Now, we call that our SCIP process. Now, SEC has a variety of different expertise to help a producer have resources to find what that next step can be. Now, what I will say is we're not meant to replace everybody on the ground. We're not going to be your nutritionist. We're not going to be the person that goes and installs something on your farm, but we can provide the resources and some technical expertise to help support the decision-making process as it is applicable to understanding the sustainability impact and efficiency impact for different on-farm practices. So as I mentioned, there's a variety of different deliverables that we produce for this project. We walked through a couple very specifically that you guys have in your hands. What we didn't look at was the specific site level report or the carbon footprint calculator that takes into account a variety of information at the actual site. What we also produce is our SCIPs. And on the left-hand side, that's going to be a graphic SCIP, as we like to call it. It is a practice implementation example of what different impacts are of these practices. So Dale mentioned that soil erosion is really important for him to know what makes sense for him to do on his farm. A few things that we touch on are very typical to the sustainability conversation around agriculture: cover crops, tillage. A few other examples that we're able to plug into that SCIP report is changing of manure and synthetic fertilizer in and out of an operation, because that has large impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, and soil erosion. And also changes in synthetic fertilizer as well, as those are big, that also has large impacts from a nitrous oxide level. On the left-hand side is what we call our narrative SCIP. This is listing out various different points that we're able to talk through with each producer. So we can develop these first and foremost on a regional scale. So we don't have too many, we have certain things that are applicable across the country, but really to make these worthwhile, we develop them on first a regional or state scale. And from there, we're able to delve into the specifics for each operation to have that conversation. We have various different key performance indicators that we identify for these, and a few of them are economics, soil health, and water quality and quantity, and air quality. Those are very important issues for the industry that we can report on progress points. Again, we're all about being proud of where we're at. We want to tell a positive agriculture story and advocate for producers first. But we also know that while this isn't always the narrative that's spoken, I see it on a day-to-day basis that producers are progressive, and more progressive than they get credit for. They are always evaluating how to improve their operation. They may not say the word sustainability, but every efficiency improvement that they make will have a sustainability impact. I'm first going to dive into energy usage, as that is a huge impact on economics. I listed out a few different practices up here that we would begin the conversation with each producer. A few examples are LED lighting. This is what we would call one of those low-hanging fruit. There's got to be things out there that maybe we've seen but haven't actually implemented that isn't so cost prohibitive. Now, we're not saying walk into your barn and switch it all out at once. That's not really realistic. But as simple as it can be, just like you do in your house, as one light bulb goes out, go ahead and find something with a higher efficiency that we can plug in. It's simply bringing that to somebody's attention and making them conscious of what the impact can be for their operation. So that will then have a cost savings for them. The next one that we talk about in various different operations is variable speed drives on fans. Now, this works in certain cases and it doesn't work in others, but what I'll say when we can do this is if we're monitoring our temperature and our fans can adjust to that, we're going to be saving energy in the long run. The next one that I'll speak to is renewable energy. Now, this would be one of those much higher cost items. We're not saying everybody needs to go put solar panels on their barns tomorrow. That's not really realistic, but what can work for certain operations? And as Dale mentioned, solar is going to work for him because he's going to provide his own energy and also get a payment for the above and beyond that he's producing on his farm. So then he can calculate out what that return on investment would be from putting in that larger infrastructure. In addition, I have in parentheses up here REAP, which is an NRCS program for rural energy, where there can be federal dollars available to help support getting renewable energy out onto the landscape further. And so as we have the discussions about different practices that a producer might be interested in, we can then dive into the individual state NRCS dollars that are available and help a producer apply for those as well, because there is an application process that comes along with that. A lot of producers are aware of their county NRCS office, and they may or may not have engaged with them. A lot of times we do hear it's another thing to do, it's an extra person to talk to, but because we have a lot of that data for their reporting, we can help streamline that process as well. And then the last one I'll talk about that we've been having conversations with producers around is heat lamps versus heat mats. And this is something that as we look at where piglets are incredibly close to the ground and ensuring that we're keeping them at an optimal temperature, we've seen producers implement the mats so that there's less heat loss in between that space, and they've seen energy savings. Now, that is a larger investment up front, but then as they work to determine the company that is most appropriate for them to choose, they can understand what those dollars savings and ROI is. The other piece that I'll mention when I talk through these practices is that SEC is agnostic when we provide resources about these different upgrades. So we are not choosing a company that a producer should go with. We don't sell anything. When I say third party, we don't sell inputs, we don't sell technology, we don't have agreements with companies that say, hey, maybe you should try this sort of meter, or maybe you should do this fan brand. That's not our space. And again, I lean back to there are experts in that area that a producer can go to that we can provide some resources for, but they can ultimately make that decision on what's going to work for their operation. The next one that I touched on a little bit earlier via the Q&A is manure stewardship. So there's a few pieces that we can talk about with producers, and they have varying capabilities to adjust these practices depending on how their individual operation is set up. Some of them are going to be applying their own manure. Some of them are going to have a custom applicator that they pay to apply their manure for them, and some of them are going to be exporting their manure, so they're not going to have a say in how that manure is applied. But there's a few things that we can look at to help ensure that that manure is being utilized to the greatest capacity. The first one is lowering our disturbance. We want to ensure that our manure is going into the ground at some level so that we don't have losses from the surface. But how do we reduce that disturbance enough so that we're not losing carbon on the flip side by using excessive tillage practices? So everything is a balance, and that's the conversation that we have with a producer when we're talking about this, that there are trade-offs. So how do we reduce that disturbance? I talked through a few of those pieces earlier, so I won't reiterate that, but that would be a big piece of manure stewardship. The next one that is beginning to be more available on a commercial level is variable rate manure and fertilizer. Fertilizer is much more common at this point. Manure is just beginning to have the technology be available to farms to ensure that we're applying in the right places specifically. So utilizing our soil tests on a few acre by few acre basis to best apply where the nutrients are needed for each field. And then lastly, the more time that we have something growing in the ground, the better nutrient use we will see. So we have a cash crop that's going to grow typically around the US, mostly in the Midwest, from April, May to September, October, November. That's a half the year. What can we do to ensure that we're not having losses throughout the rest of the year? We can throw on a cover crop. I make that sound a little easier than it is, but they do have an impact when we're applying that manure. They're able to soak up the nutrients, ensure that it's in a biological form. The cover crop then dies at the end of the winter, and then those nutrients become available again. So we're ensuring that those nutrients aren't being lost off the field via erosion or from leaching. The next that I'll talk about is both water and air. And as I mentioned, there's importance on water for both quantity reasons, how much we're using, and quality reasons, ensuring that we are protecting the resources that all of us enjoy. And then air quality is also a piece of this puzzle. Water meters, those are a tool that producers typically have if they are not on, say, well water. So they're going to have that because they're going to be paying a bill. Now, a lot of pork operations are going to be on well water because they're out in the country. And so they're not tracking that. And that's not to say that's the worst thing, but again, we can't know where we're going. We can't know how to reduce that if we don't know where we're at and we don't understand where our higher usages are coming in at. And so, as Dale said, when he was evaluating whether he should put in water meters or not, he found one of the most important use cases was, if I have a line break, I'm going out in the morning and the evening. That could be a few hours that water is running that I couldn't realize previously. Now I can get a notification that tells me when something goes wrong so that I can preemptively stop that. The next one that I'll talk about is analyses. So there's both manure analyses. Now, in a lot of states, these are required, but producers update them at varying frequencies. And so when we're gathering a manure analysis, we want to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information so that we do know the amount of nutrients going on our fields when it's applied, not when it was sitting there for 6 months. So we want to ensure that manure samples are utilized when we are applying manure. The other piece to that is that's the application side, the nutrient addition. There's also the portion that's already in the soil that we need to know what's there so we can apply the right amount. So soil tests, again, those are regulated for various different states, but ensuring that we do have updated soil tests is very important because that regulation does change depending on where we're at in the US. And then the last one that we've seen fairly prevalent lately is different filters around the sites. And I use that word kind of liberally, but essentially if we plant trees around the site, we're going to have a lot less odor going out into the community where someone is going to throw a flag and start complaining. And so if we can plant trees around our sites, that's automatically going to support air quality and build that filter there. One other more recent upgrade that we've seen is using a biofilter, which is essentially a wood chip in chicken wire, more or less. A bunch of wood chips are just placed by the fans that are going out of the barn so that that air has to filter through. So it's a fairly simple, we've seen them built by individual producers, and then there's also groups that a producer can utilize to build them for them. So protecting air quality around so that we can build a relationship with our community and help support those that are support habitat as well. The last piece I wanted to talk about is I've gone through a variety of different practices that we can touch on with different economic impact. Now, what's important is that we want to talk about this from an environmental benefit, a sustainability benefit, but ultimately farms are businesses, so we have to have a business case as well. The business case is going to change where we're at geographically and for each producer on what their operation looks like, but there's a few tools we can utilize to talk through that. So we actually have an R3 ROI tool. Robust, resilient, and reliable is what the 3 R's stand for, and it's a fairly simple calculation on understanding what I was saying, that we have to know why we're doing it, and we have to be making a profit from it, or understand what the costs are in that trade-off. So we start with a baseline. Again, we need to know where we're at. We evaluate what's realistic for that next step for each producer, and then we're able to show the difference that that makes. So for example, Dale mentioned talking about different tillage practices. As we reduce tillage, we then reduce an equipment cost, and we reduce a labor cost, and we reduce a fuel cost. What does that mean per acre for each operation? We're able to show some calculations to talk through that. Lastly, I was going to talk about a success story. This has been brought up a few times today, so you guys have heard a little bit about it, but Iowa Select has put out their analysis that they have coined their Smart Soil Partnership. So they do a lot in the community already with various different donations and community events and volunteer hours. One piece that they haven't been giving themselves credit for is the manure that they provide to different farms around their operations, around their sites. And so with this release, they have been able to talk about the different practices that are happening specifically on those acres, and then the manure benefit that that has. And so with that, they're evaluating what practices they can help incentivize and what practices they want to talk about with the producers that are within their supply chain. And with that, I can pause. Those are a few different sustainable continuous improvement plan examples. I know when we're talking in general, it's mostly a list of ideas, and then as we dive in with each producer, there's a lot of back and forth on the resources that are needed, the costs that are associated, and the pros and cons that we need to consider when we are evaluating practice change.